CD3.
The two friends waited for the detective on the terrace. "I didn't know you had a friend who was a cop." Matt looked surprised. "How'd you meet this guy?" "He's the one who investigated my mother's suicide," Elliot mumbled. "He helped me a lot at the time, and we've kept in touch. You'll see he's a good guy." The two men had moved toward the table and were staring at the windproof lighter left behind by the time traveler. It was a silver-colored Zippo inlaid with shiny little stars with the inscription Millennium Edition. "That's a strange expression," said Elliot. "Yeah," Matt agreed, kneeling so he could study it more closely. "It looks like it was manufactured in a limited edition to commemorate something like the arrival of the year 2000. Elliot finished the sentence, suddenly grasping the enormity of what he was saying. "Nah, that's bull," said Matt, and stood up. A few minutes later, a police car drew up in front of the house, and Elliot hurried down to greet Detective Malden. He was a cop of the old school, a kind of aging Humphrey Bogart in a trench coat and fedora, but with a boxer's physique. He'd started at the bottom, learning his job on the streets. He'd been patrolling San Francisco for nearly 40 years, and he knew all the city's secrets. But the old policeman had not come alone. He introduced his new partner, Detective Douglas, to Elliot. Douglas was a young detective who'd just graduated from the police academy with a degree in criminology. Carefully coiffed and dressed, he was wearing a well-tailored suit and a neatly knotted tie. At 2 a.m. "What happened, Elliot?" asked Malden, as he came onto the terrace pointing to the shards of glass. "Someone throw a rock through your window?" "I'd like you to take some prints from this lighter," he explained ingenuously, as though this were commonplace. Like a dutiful student, Douglas had already taken out his pen and notebook. "Has there been a break-in or a burglary?" he asked. "Not exactly," Matt answered. "It's a little more complicated." "If you're not filing a complaint, we can't do anything for you," said the young detective, with a touch of annoyance. "Take it easy, Douglas," said Malden. Elliot was beginning to understand that he was going to have trouble avoiding an explanation. On the pretext of making some coffee, he brought the older cop into the kitchen with him so he could speak to him in private. "Now, Elliot, explain to me what happened," said Malden, as he lit up a cigarillo. When he remained silent, Malden remembered their first meeting. Even though it was 20 years ago, he recalled it as if it had been yesterday. One rainy night, he had been called to investigate the suicide of a woman who had jumped from a downtown apartment building. He'd found identification on the body. Her name was Rose Cooper, and had taken it on himself to break the awful news to her husband and her son. When his mother committed suicide, Elliot was barely 10. Malden remembered him as an appealing child, intelligent and sensitive. He'd also met the kid's father, a businessman, who hadn't seemed particularly upset by the news of his wife's death. Malden remembered, too, the marks and the bruises he'd seen on the boy's arms. In fact, he'd guessed at rather than actually seen those marks. Perhaps it was this kind of intuition that made him a good cop. He sensed things. And in this case, he sensed them all the better because his own father had regularly beaten him with a belt when he got home from his day at the factory. Of course, he could have turned a blind eye. People didn't pay too much attention to that kind of thing in those days. But he'd come back to see Elliot the next day, and the day after that. He'd taken the opportunity to drop a few hints to the father. to show him that he knew and that he intended
As
to
time
keep an eye
progressed,
on the kid.
Malden kept in touch with Elliot and took an interest in his education. He had an old-fashioned view of his job, seeing himself as a policeman who cared about people in general, rather than just about arresting criminals. Now the policeman took the cup of coffee Elliot handed him and rubbed his eyes to dispel the memories. He had to focus on the present. "If you don't tell me anything," he insisted, "I won't be able to help you." "I know that, but..." "But what?" "When my mother died, you asked me to trust you, and you promised that when I needed help, you'd be there for me." "It's still true, kid." "Well, today I need you. I need not only the policeman, but also the friend. The policeman to analyze those prints, and the friend to trust me, even if I can't explain anything right now." Malden sighed. "Those are fine words, but I can't do a fingerprint analysis just like that. I need authorization. I'd have to prepare a report. We'd have to get a team from the lab on it. Besides, it could take several days, maybe even weeks, but I need a result right away." Malden thought for a while, scratching his head. His star had been waning for a while at headquarters. Officially, he was criticized for disregarding the chain of command and using unorthodox methods to get results. In fact, he hadn't been forgiven for going a little too far in a corruption investigation that had tarnished the reputations of some important municipal figures. Malden knew that he was now on a tight leash and that his new partner was there primarily to keep an eye on him and wait for him to make a mistake. All of this should have made him cautious, but he had a promise to keep. A promise he had made 20 years before to a kid who had just lost his mother. "Maybe I've got an idea about how to get those prints without going through the usual channels," he said suddenly. "How?" "You'll see," he said, looking mysterious. "It's not regulations, not by a long shot. But it might work." Back in the living room, he sent Douglas out to buy a tube of superglue. "And where am I supposed to find that at 2 in the morning?" Douglas complained. Malden gave his partner the address of a camera shop that was open all night and sold the glue, which was manufactured by Kodak. While Douglas was doing that, Malden kneeled and scrutinized the inscription on the lighter. "Millennium Edition. What does that mean?" he asked, turning to Matt. "We don't know any more than you do," he said, opening a can of Coke. "You didn't touch it, at least. If you did, no prints." "We're not that dumb," Matt protested. "We've seen the cop shows." Malden gazed balefully at him and then said to Elliot, "I need a cardboard box." "How big?" "A shoebox will do." Elliot rummaged in his bedroom closet and came up with a shoebox. In the meantime, Malden had picked up the lamp from the table, taken off the shade, and put his hand on the lit bulb to judge its temperature. Douglas got back a few minutes later, proudly brandishing a tube of superglue. At first, he had taken Malden for a has-been. But he'd been forced to acknowledge that the old cop's ingenuity surprised him more and more every day. In fact, he'd learned more in a few weeks with Malden than in his 3 years of training. "Everything's ready," Malden announced. "Let the show begin." "You're going to take prints with a cardboard box and a tube of glue?" asked Matt incredulously. "Exactly. And you've never seen that on the cop shows, my boy." Malden asked Matt to give him the Coke can he'd just drained. The policeman took a penknife out of his pocket and used it to cut out the bottom of the aluminum can.
He squeezed the contents of the tube of glue into his little improvised dish, then he picked up and set it next to the light, used the heat radiating from the bulb to heat the glue. A nasty smell soon filled the room. Malden covered it all with the cardboard box and turned to his audience with a satisfied look on his face. "Just a few more minutes and it'll be ready," he said with a smile. "What exactly did you do?" asked Matt, looking more and more dubious. With one eye on the box, Malden adopted a professorial tone and explained, "The chemical name of superglue is cyanoacrylate." "Well, what do you know?" said Matt. Malden gave him a black look, which meant that he didn't want to be interrupted, and Matt got the message. "The heat causes the cyanoacrylate vapors to be drawn to the amino acids and lipids, the basic ingredients of human perspiration carried by the prince. And polymerization will take place," said Elliot, who was beginning to understand. "Poly what?" asked Douglas, who felt completely lost. "Polymerization," explained Malden. "That means the superglue vapors will settle on the fingerprint, which is invisible to the naked eye, and form a kind of protective shell that will make it possible to bring out the print and to preserve it." Matt and Douglas looked at the old policeman doubtfully. They were, in fact, witnessing a pioneering experiment that would revolutionize the work of investigators around the world within a few years. Elliot kept on staring at the box, anxious to find out what it would reveal. After a minute, Malden decided that enough time had passed and picked up the box. A solid white deposit had settled on 3 spots on the lighter, revealing the distinct traces of 3 fingerprints. "And there you have it," he said, bending over. "At first sight, we have a fine thumbprint on one side, and on the other, I'd say, the tips of an index finger and a middle finger." He carefully wrapped the evidence in a handkerchief and slipped it into his trench coat pocket. "If I understand you right," he said, turning to Elliot, "you want me to compare these prints with the ones we have on file." "Not exactly," the doctor corrected him. "I want you to compare them with mine." Matching his words with action, he took a fountain pen out of his pocket and dipped a little ink on the table, pressed each finger into it, and set down his own prints on a blank piece of paper. Malden took the sheet of paper and looked Elliot in the eye. "Even though I don't understand what this is all about, I'll do it anyway, because I trust you." The young doctor nodded silently, his way of thanking the policeman. Matt finally dared to ask another question. "Will it take long to compare the 2 sets of prints?" "I'll get right on it," Malden assured him. "Since the prints are good, I hope for some quick results." Elliot showed the 2 policemen out. While Douglas went to get the car, Malden promised, "I'll call you as soon as I'm done." Then, after hesitating a moment, he asked, "By the way, are you still with your Brazilian, Elena?" "Still?" answered Elliot, a little surprised by the question. "Well, with us it's—" Held back by shyness, he didn't finish his sentence, but Malden had gotten the point. "I understand," he said, and lowered his head. "When a person comes into your heart, it's forever." Elliot was moved as he watched the old policeman walk off. He knew that for the last few years he'd been living with his wife's losing battle with Alzheimer's, and that the bell for the final round was about to ring. It was 3 a.m, but Elliot wasn't sleepy. He'd gone back with Matt to pick up his VW and stopped at a gas station on Market Street. As he was filling his tank, lost in thought, a toothless woman started yelling at him. She was pushing a shopping cart full of rags and old junk and seemed to be drunk attention to her stream of insults. He worked 2 days a month as a volunteer doctor at the Free Clinic, a municipally run center for the needy, and he knew that the city at night was a different place. In tourist guides and movies, San Francisco always appeared at its best, with its colorful neighborhoods, housing for the most part confined to 2 or 3 stories, and numerous green spaces. And there were the constant reminders of the city's hippie fame. It was true that San Francisco had had its moment of glory in the 60s, when in the wake of Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, hundreds of flower children had moved into the Victorian houses of Haight-Ashbury. But the summer of love was long gone. The hippie movement was slowly dying out, undermined by its own excesses. Joplin and Hendrix had both died at 27, Hendrix drowning in his own vomit after stuffing himself full of sleeping pills, and Joplin from a heroin overdose. By the end of 1976, most people seemed to have lost interest in free love and communal living. Drugs, in particular, had done incredible harm. Supposed to open minds and free people from their inhibitions, LSD, methamphetamine, and heroin had instead caused addiction and slow death. Elliot had seen the terrible effects for himself at the clinic: overdoses, hepatitis from dirty needles, pneumonia, bad trips that made people jump out of windows. Piled on top of this was the problem of the Vietnam veterans, many of whom had joined the ranks of the growing army of homeless people in the city. American troops had withdrawn from Saigon the year before, and many traumatized veteran returnees now lived in slums or out on the streets of San Francisco. Elliot paid for the gas and drove through the city with his windows open, thinking of the strange conversation he'd had earlier that night. After leaving Matt, he felt alone and vulnerable again. He was forced to concede at last that everything his visitor had said to him was true, from the beatings his father had given him to the guilt he had felt when his mother committed suicide. Why had he never talked about all that with Elena? Why had he never considered showing his weaknesses to the woman he loved? And Matt? He hadn't told him anything either. Simply out of male reticence? The truth was that it was easier. With Matt, everything could be kept light-hearted and frivolous. His company was a comfortable way for Elliot to protect himself from the harsh realities of the world, and to recharge his batteries when the responsibilities of his job became too burdensome. Even though there was nothing better than love and friendship to make life bearable, in the final analysis, there were some situations you could only deal with on your own. A few miles away, Detective Malden was busy in his office at police headquarters. He'd just quarreled with his young partner who'd criticized him for doing private work while he was on duty. Malden knew that Douglas was ambitious. He barely concealed his hope that Malden would be fired so he could get a fast promotion. When the little bastard had threatened to file a report, Malden had chewed him out and sent him off to an office in another part of the building. It was too bad. Douglas could have been a good cop. He had all the necessary qualities, but he'd picked the wrong way to go about it. In Malden's day, you didn't try to succeed at any cost by pushing other people out of your way. But maybe he was getting old. Maybe the younger generation had different values, more ambition, more individual initiative, the kind of things Reagan talked about on television. Malden finished his mug of coffee. This time he was sure Douglas would follow through on his threats. Too bad. If the top brass finally did do him in, Well, he'd quit the job and spend even more time in the hospital. Retirement age was not far off. In the meantime, he would help Elliot one more time by doing what he'd asked. He began by staining the prints that had shown up on the lighter with a fluorescent dye. Then he took a set of photographs that would have to be developed and enlarged. Only then would the real analysis begin. He looked at his watch anxiously. He had some tedious work ahead of him, and the night was not long enough. Before going home, Elliot stopped at an all-night grocery on Van Ness where he bought cigarettes and a box of dog food. "Hello, tramp," he said as he opened his door. He'd barely come onto the terrace before the Labrador ran up and licked his hand just as he'd licked the stranger's hand a few hours earlier. "You don't have to overdo it," said Elliot, and poured the dog food into an improvised bowl. He stood watching the lab for a while, surprised to discover that he appreciated the company. He swept up the glass and smoked a few cigarettes, staring into space, his mind wandering back to his childhood. Every 5 minutes he anxiously looked over at the telephone, waiting for the verdict on the fingerprint analysis. Even if this whole thing didn't make sense, he couldn't help feeling overwrought, as though he were waiting for the results of some medical tests that might reveal the existence of a fatal disease. Assistant Detective Douglas tore up the report he'd just finished typing. He stood up and went downstairs to the room they used for breaks. Tonight the station was unusually quiet. Douglas made 2 cups of coffee, went back to the 3rd floor, and knocked on Malden's office door. The only answer he heard was a grunt, which he decided to interpret as an invitation. "Need a hand?" he asked, sticking his head in the doorway. "Maybe," the old cop said gruffly. Douglas handed him a cup of coffee and glanced around the room. Pinned to the wall were about 10 greatly enlarged photographs offering a view of the labyrinth of fingerprints. Cops loved fingerprints. "The only snitches that never lie," was the common saying. Placed end to end, the photographs seemed to make up a strange tapestry, resembling a huge topographical map. Gently sloping lines, bifurcations, crests, and little islands that might be combined in an infinite number of patterns. A fingerprint is a unique work of art that takes shape in the months before birth. In the mother's womb, the fetus goes through a myriad of little stress situations which randomly shape the finger's flesh. Everything happens before the 6th month of pregnancy. After that, the shapes become fixed and remain the same for life. Douglas had learned at the police academy that every finger had about 150 characteristic points. To decide whether 2 prints were identical, you just had to identify correspondences between these characteristic signs. A dozen common points were needed for authentication to have legal validity. "Let's get to work," he said to his boss. Douglas had sharp eyes. Malden had patience. The 2 of them made a good team. At dawn, Elliot decided to take a shower. He put on fresh clothes and left the house for work at the hospital. On the way, he had to turn on his headlights and wipers. In a few hours, the weather had completely changed. The sky that had been so clear the night before was now full of clouds, promising one of those rainy mornings that were a sign of the coming of winter. He turned on the radio to listen to the news. It was all disturbing. A deadly earthquake in China, military repression in Argentina, an oil spill off the coast of France, a massacre in Soweto in South Africa, while in Houston, a maniac barricaded in his house was taking pot shots at the public. Meanwhile, in post-Watergate America, the presidential contest between Ford and Carter was in full swing. Disillusioned, Elliot changed the station and finished his trip listening to the Beatles singing. He had just entered the hospital lobby when the guard stopped him. "A call for you, doctor." Elliot took the phone that was handed to him.
"I have your results," said Malden.
He took a deep breath and asked, "What did they say?"
"The prints are identical."
"You're sure about your results?"
"Certain. We verified them several times."
But Elliot wasn't yet ready to accept the evidence. "In absolute terms," he asked, "what are the chances of two different people having identical fingerprints?"
1 in several billion.
Even twins have different prints. Since the doctor didn't seem to be reacting, Malden made his conclusion even clearer.
"I don't know what your problem is, Elliot, but the two sets of prints came from the same person. There is no possible doubt. That person is you."
Chapter 7. I keep death at bay by living, suffering, fooling myself, taking risks, giving and losing. Anais Nin. September 2006. Elliot is 60. The blinds were slanted so that the sunlight hit the walls before washing over the walnut floors. Wearing an old pair of jeans and a cable-knit sweater, Elliot went down the metal staircase leading to the kitchen. It was his day off, and he was determined to take his time eating breakfast. After a shower and shave, he felt refreshed. This morning he was feeling no pain, as though the extraordinary events of the night before had driven the specter of death a little further away. He poured a glass of orange juice, fixed a bowl of muesli, and went into the garden to eat. It looked like it was going to be a beautiful day. A few fleeting images from his nocturnal adventure were still running through his head. He felt more elated than puzzled. He still didn't know what was in the pills, but so what? They really worked. Most importantly, this second journey had enabled him to clear up several points. He thought he now had a better grasp of the mechanics of his time traveling. First, the time interval had been the same on each occasion, 30 years to the date. The first time he'd noticed the date on a display at the airport, and last night he had seen it in a newspaper on the table. Next, he could obviously transport objects into the past, because his clothing had gone with him on both trips. And he could also bring objects back to his own time. The blood-stained napkin was the best evidence of that. But there was something that still bothered him. His time in the past was so short. 20 minutes each trip wasn't very much. Just enough time to exchange a few words with his double, and then he was shaking, which meant he was about to return to the future. But maybe it was too soon to find the real reason for this pattern. In any case, one thing was certain. Dreams were what made it possible for him to travel through time. Back in the house, he sat down in front of his computer. He was a surgeon, of course, but what did he really know about sleep and dreams? Not much, in fact. He had absorbed tons of knowledge as a medical student, but forgotten a lot of it. To refresh his memory, he spent the next hour consulting an online medical encyclopedia. Sleep is made up of different phases that succeed one another and repeat throughout the night. Okay, he remembered that. What else? Light sleep corresponds to the phases of slow-wave sleep, and deep sleep to the phases of paradoxical sleep. Paradoxical sleep? That reminded him of something. This expression designates the phase of sleep in which brain activity is most intense, whereas the body is completely atonic, with relaxation of all muscles from neck to toe. Fine. But where did dreams come in? We spend about 25 years of our life sleeping.
That amounts to
and
somewhere
about between 100,000 and 500,000 dreams. Eliot pondered that number for a little while. So human life was filled with hundreds of thousands of dreams. That was both fascinating and disturbing. Sensing that he was on the right track, he allowed himself to light a cigarette and kept reading. Periods of paradoxical sleep occur approximately every 90 minutes and last for a full 15 minutes. It is during these phases that the most complex dreams occur. The last detail made him fidget in his seat. Everything fit together. Last night he'd gone to sleep at around 10 and reappeared 30 years earlier around 11:30. His journey had thus lasted 90 minutes, the same length of time it took to reach the first phase of paradoxical sleep. So that was how it worked. During that period of brain activity, the substance in the pill provoked in him a return to the past. It might all seem completely off the wall, but he'd reached a stage in his life when, since he no longer believed in anything, he was ready to believe almost everything. With a few clicks of the mouse, he continued exploring this mysterious continent, and discovered that while science had discovered many things about how people dreamed, it didn't have much to say about why. In many respects, dreaming was still a mystery. Like any programmed activity of the body or mind, dreaming had to have a function, a purpose. But what was it? No one had yet provided a scientific answer to that question. Of course, there were all those esoteric theories going back to ancient Egypt that saw dreams as signs sent by the gods or by some invisible world. But who could believe such nonsense? Eliot was considering the possibilities when his thoughts were interrupted by the phone. He answered and recognized the voice of Samuel Bellow, the lab technician he'd asked to analyze the residue in the pill bottle. "I have the results of your analysis," Bellow said. 1976. Eliot is 30. At the same time of day, 30 years earlier, Eliot was finishing his coffee in the break room at Lenox Hospital. For the 10th time that morning, the young doctor was scrutinizing the fingerprint photographs that Malden had sent him by messenger. At this point, he was compelled to believe the unbelievable. Somewhere in the future, another him had found a way to travel in time so as to pay him a few visits. But as for figuring out how he did it, that was another story. Eliot had never been much of a science fiction fan, but he had studied Einstein's theory of relativity. And what did he have to say about time travel? That it was entirely possible, provided you could exceed the speed of light. Eliot had trouble imagining his strange visitor orbiting the Earth at 200,000 miles a second, like some aging Superman, though. It seemed he had to look elsewhere for the answer. Maybe it had something to do with black holes. He'd seen a documentary on television about them, dying stars with gravitational fields that were able to bend space-time. It was theoretically possible to imagine a body being sucked into one of those black holes and projected into another time, another universe. Sure, but no one had yet been able to observe a black hole, and it was hardly likely that a human body could go through one of them without being torn to bits. Besides, what about all the temporal paradoxes that spiced up all the novels and movies about time travel? Suppose when you went back into the past, you prevented your future mother and father from meeting. Suppose you killed your parents before you were conceived. Then you were trapped in a vicious circle of existence and non-existence. I killed my ancestor. Therefore, I wasn't born. Therefore, I didn't kill my ancestor. Therefore, I was born. I killed my ancestor. Elliot sighed. If you accepted the possibility of time travel, you agreed to violate a dozen physical laws, and you denied all principles of causality and logical consistency. And yet, the photos he had in his hands were in fact proof that the whole story was true. Definitive scientific proof, he thought, remembering that every individual's fingerprints were unique. His mind wandered as he fiddled with the windproof lighter that Malden had given back to him, setting off a little shower of sparks. He snapped the Zippo shut and quickly stood up. He felt unable to keep still. In the last few hours, he must have drunk a dozen cups of coffee. The fear he'd felt the night before hadn't gone away, but it was mingled with the excitement of experiencing something that eluded his grasp. He was an ordinary man, and something extraordinary was happening to him. Where was all of this leading? He didn't have the slightest idea. From this point on, he was entering into the unknown and wasn't sure he could face what was coming. He poured another cup of coffee and opened the window facing the street. He was alone in the room, so he nervously lit a cigarette, which he puffed on carefully to avoid setting off the smoke detector. For the last few minutes, a question had been gnawing at him. Could he communicate with his other self living in the future? Why not? But how should he go about it? And what message should he send? He thought about it for a while without coming up with any obvious solution. Like a comet from out of nowhere, a wild idea came to him then, but he rejected it. No, he couldn't do just anything. He had to calm down, put all of this aside for a while, and get back to work. Full of good intentions, he sat down at a table in front of a stack of patient files to complete his surgical reports. But after a couple of minutes, he gave up pretending. How could he concentrate after what he'd just been through? He looked at his watch. He had a good 2 hours before his next operation, and with a little luck, he'd find someone to replace him on call. He took off his white coat, picked up his jacket, and walked out. 5 minutes later, he left the hospital. As he was leaving the parking lot, a FedEx truck was coming in. Intoxicated by what he was experiencing, Elliot looked at it with a smile of defiance. He'd show FedEx and UPS. He, Elliot Cooper, was going to send a message 30 years into the future. 2006. Elliot is 60. "I have the results of your analysis," said Bello. "What do they say?" "Well, it's something botanical. A compound of mulberry and medlar leaves, essentially." Elliot couldn't believe his ears. "Nothing else?" "No. If you want to know what I think, this medicine can't do much. It's just a placebo." Stunned, the doctor hung up. So there was no magic ingredient in his pills. The old Cambodian, the idea that he could make a wish, the hope of seeing Elena again, that was all a joke. The cancer must have spread to his brain. The encounter with his double 30 years earlier must have happened only in his head. At the end of his life, his mind was wandering. This was it, then, the purpose of dreams. He should be thinking about psychoanalysis, not science. Dreams were nothing but representations of repressed desires, a kind of safety valve that let the unconscious express itself without endangering psychological equilibrium. Elliot had knocked at Einstein's door, but it was Freud who had answered. So, a simple phone call had brought him back to Earth. The magic had disappeared, and in the harsh light of morning, what had seemed so real to him the night before was revealed as
He
nothing
had
but a
so
mad
much
illusion.
wanted
To believe in it. But no. This splendid adventure, this brief journey in time, was purely an invention of his own mind. Illness and imminent death had driven him to fantasize about a possible return to a crucial moment in his past. The truth was that he was scared to death. He refused to accept that his life was almost over. Everything had happened so fast. Childhood, adolescence, youth, maturity. A few blinks of the eye and it was already time to go? Jesus, 60 was too young. He didn't feel like an old man. Before he'd been diagnosed with cancer, he'd been in great shape. When he went on humanitarian missions, he'd trek through mountains, leaving young guys of 30 or 40 behind. And Sharika, his Indian intern, a real beauty. She wanted to go out with him, not with one of the pretty boys who were just starting out. But that was all over. Finished and done with. He had nothing to look forward to but death and fear. The fear of seeing his body grow weak. The fear of suffering and losing his independence. The fear of dying all alone in a bare hospital room. The fear of leaving his daughter at the mercy of this uncertain world. The fear that in the end his life had had no meaning. And the fear of what was waiting for him afterward, once he'd given up the ghost and gone over to the other side.
Oh, shit.
He wiped away a tear of rage from his cheek. Right now, a fierce pain was ripping through his guts. He went into the bathroom, rummaged in the medicine cabinet for a painkiller, and splashed some water on his face. The man he saw in the mirror had glittering, bloodshot eyes. How much time did he have left? A few days? A few weeks? As never before, he felt the need to live, to run, to breathe, to talk, to love. You couldn't say he'd made a mess of his life. He had a daughter whom he adored. He'd been useful. He'd traveled, known many pleasures, and had good times with Matt. But there had always been something missing. Elena. Since her death 30 years ago, he'd somehow lived a detached life, more like a spectator than a participant in his own existence. And it was true that for the last few days he'd come to believe in the idea of time travel for the slightly crazy hope of being able to see Elena again before he died. But now the illusion had faded, and he was angry with himself for being taken in. You'll stop hurting when you stop hoping. That was what people said. And Elliot wanted to stop hurting. So, to permanently extinguish the last glimmer of hope still lingering in his heart, he threw the little bottle of pills down the toilet. He hesitated for a minute, and then he flushed. 1976. Elliot is 30. Elliot parked his bug on Valencia Street in the Mission District. At this time of day, the Hispanic neighborhood was already humming with activity. The inexpensive stores and the taco and fruit stands made Mission one of the most picturesque parts of the city. The doctor walked down the street in the middle of a noisy, vibrant crowd. The facades of all the buildings were decorated with brightly colored murals. Elliot stopped briefly to look at these fascinating paintings that reminded him of the style of Diego Rivera. But he wasn't there as a tourist. He carried on, walking a little faster. The place had a harsh, charged atmosphere that some people found enticing. But it also had its bad aspects, like the Chicano gangs that insulted passers-by and ruined the convivial atmosphere of the neighborhood. At the intersection of Dolores Street, after a row of salsa clubs and stores selling religious articles, he finally saw the sign he was looking for. Blue Moon, He pushed open the door and came face to face with a poster of Freddie Mercury in drag. The singer from Queen was blatantly miming a sex act. On the turntable near the cash register, a reggae tune by Bob Marley was playing at full volume, made popular by Eric Clapton's cover of I Shot the Sheriff the year before. Elliot sighed. This was not really his scene, but he put on a brave face. "Christina?" he called out, heading toward the back of the store. "Dr. Cooper, what a surprise!" The tall blonde woman in front of him looked tough. She was wearing motorcycle boots, leather hot pants, and had an outrageous tattoo at the base of her spine. Elliot had met her at the hospital 6 months before when he'd operated on her son for a defective kidney. Since then, he'd been regularly monitoring the baby, a Chinese boy that Christina was raising with her partner, Leila, a surgical nurse he worked with. From their first meeting, Elliot had been intrigued by the free spirit of this woman, a Berkeley graduate with a degree in Asian studies who decided to open a tattoo parlor instead of teaching in a university. Christina lived the way she wanted and openly displayed her homosexuality. That wasn't a problem in San Francisco. The gays had taken over from the hippies as the presiding group in the city a few years before. Drawn by the city's tolerance, tens of thousands of homosexuals had moved into the Castro and Noah Valley neighborhoods. "I'll be with you in a minute," she said, offering him a seat. The doctor sat down next to a transvestite from South America who was having his ears pierced. Elliot felt a little embarrassed and asked if he could use the phone to call Matt with his latest news. When he told Matt about the fingerprint analysis, his friend didn't seem overly troubled. "Nobody but you has ever seen this guy," he pointed out. "If you want to know what I think, this whole thing happened in your head." "What do you mean, in my head?" Elliot was annoyed. "And the Millennium Edition lighter with my fingerprints, that's in my head?" "It must be something you bought, but don't remember buying it. That's all." Elliot was devastated. "So you don't believe me?" "No," Matt admitted. "And I hopes that if I told you a story like that, you wouldn't believe me either, and you'd try to get me to see reason." "Thanks for your support," Elliot replied, and hung up, very angry. "So, doctor, what can I do for you?" asked Christina, motioning him into a chair. "What would you say to a Hell's Angels tattoo, or a big dragon on your back?" "Neither one," he said, and rolled his shirt sleeve all the way up. "I just want a little inscription there, at the top of my shoulder." "You wouldn't prefer something more artistic?" she said, as she prepared a needle. "Look at that one." Christina turned her leg a little, revealing a kind of Japanese devil beneath the mesh of the stocking on her upper thigh. "That's a real work of art," Elliot conceded, "but it's not quite my style." "A pity. You're not bad looking, and there's nothing sexier than a tattoo on your lover's body." "I don't think my girlfriend would agree." "Women can sometimes surprise you." "There I have to agree with you." He took a pen out of his jacket pocket and wrote a few words on the back of a magazine. "That's what I want," he said, and handed it to Christina. The young woman frowned. "Is that some kind of code?" "Let's just say it's a personal message to an old friend." Christina checked her tattooing needles. "It'll hurt a little at the beginning, and then the pain will fade. You won't regret this." Elliot closed his eyes for a second. Could there really be interaction between present and future? It seemed absurd, but he had to try. To give himself courage, he imagined the expression on his double's face 30 years in the future, if he got this message. The strident noise of the machine filled the room, and Christina said, as though she were reciting a creed, The body is one of the last places where we can be free. 2006. Elliot is 60. After flushing the pills down the toilet, still feeling disappointed, Elliot stretched out on the living room couch. He had a date with Angie at noon, and he didn't want to turn up looking like a zombie. With his eyes closed, he listened to his own breathing. He wanted it to be free and regular, but it was halting and congested. He felt as though he were suffocating, unable to catch his breath. The disease fiercely at work inside his body contrasted with the gentle light filtering through the clear-story windows. Outside, he could hear birdsong and the sound of the sea. Outside, life went on, but he was no longer part of it. Despite the sunlight, he started to shiver, probably a fever starting. At the same time, he felt a tingling in his upper arm, just where it met the shoulder. It wasn't really a pain, more like something being stuck in his flesh. He rubbed the stiff muscle with his hand, but that had no effect. He stood up, took off his sweater, rolled up the sleeve of his t-shirt. At first, he couldn't see much. A vague, mottled spot, bottle green in color, that seemed to be spreading out across his shoulder. Intrigued, he stood in front of the large bathroom mirror. As he watched, he understood that the strange blotches were in reality letters taking shape one by one. He stood there stunned for a moment, wondering what was happening. Then he finally understood. The little bastard. His weary heart was beating like mad, but he was relieved. No, he wasn't crazy. Everything was not just in his head. 30 years earlier, the kid was trying to send him a message by getting a tattoo. Not so dumb, he thought, and drew closer to the mirror. He stared at his eyes and saw that they were glittering. It was stupid, but he was weeping for joy. Sure, he would die soon, but he wasn't senile yet. On his shoulder, a short phrase was displayed in dark letters. Waiting for your next visit. Yes, sure, there'd be another visit, except that he'd been stupid enough to get rid of the pills. Panicked, he kneeled in front of the toilet and stuck his hand as far down as he could, hoping but not really believing that the bottle hadn't been flushed away. No, he had to stop kidding himself. He got up and tried to think calmly. Where did the water flow to? He didn't really know. He'd never been much for tinkering, not to mention plumbing. So he ran down to the garage below and looked up at the ceiling where he saw a tangle of pipes. He followed the main line to a cast-iron plate, the waste trap. With a little luck, the bottle was stuck there. He lifted the metal lid and rummaged around in the sludge, but he found nothing. This was the end of the adventure. The bottle must have gone on its way to a water purification plant, and he would never find it again. Damn it! He'd ruined everything with one angry gesture. What else could he try? In sheer desperation, he went outside and rang the bell of his nearest neighbors, an old couple full of hormones and Viagra, all their wrinkles removed by plastic surgery, who were obsessed with exercise and nutrition. "Hello, Nina," he said on the doorstep. "Hello, Elliot. What brings you here?" she asked, and looked him up and down, wondering why his hands and arms were covered with smelly mud. She didn't like me very much already, he thought. A criminal who smokes, drinks real coffee, and eats meat that's full of cholesterol. Could I borrow a few tools from Paul? Paul's gone swimming. But let's see if you can find something. Elliot followed her into the shed, where he found exactly what he needed in the form of a fire axe. "Are you sure everything's okay, Elliot?" she asked, as she saw him take hold of the weapon. "Just fine, Nina," he assured her, giving her a smile like Jack Nicholson's in The Shining. He went back to his garage, where he began methodically to demolish everything that bore even the slightest resemblance to a pipe. The operation took a good half hour, and the whole place was soon flooded. Every time he knocked down a pipe, he checked to make sure the bottle was not stuck in an elbow. Leave nothing to chance. Keep going as long as there's some hope. That's what he'd always done in his profession, and in 35 years on the job, he'd sometimes managed to save desperate cases. So why not today? Axe in hand, up to his knees in water, it would have been easy to mistake him for a madman. "If the police came now, I'd probably be locked up," he said to himself, as he feverishly chopped down another pipe. And besides, maybe that's what he was, a madman. But the madman thinks he's wise, and the wise man realizes that he's nothing but a fool. Who said that? Shakespeare? Jesus? Buddha? Whoever it was, he was damn well right. And even if he was crazy, at least he felt alive. Alive! Alive! A last blow of the axe destroyed what was left of the pipes. Elliot had no strength left. He fell to his knees in the icy water. He stayed there for a while, exhausted and beaten. So it was over. The pills were gone for good. And then, all of a sudden, it appeared, a little glass bottle bobbing on the surface. Elliot threw himself on it as though it were the Holy Grail. He trembled as he wiped his hands dry on his shirt and opened the tightly closed bottle. The 8 pills were still there, completely dry. Collapsed in the foul water, half crazed, with his fist clutching the frail container, Elliot let out a sigh of relief. Maybe he only had a few weeks to live, but he had just found the most important thing again: hope. Chapter 8. You can do anything. Think or believe what you like. Have all the knowledge in the world. But if you don't love someone, you are nothing. Marcel Sauvageau. 2006. Elliot is 60. Elliot was looking out the window, waiting for the taxi he'd called. He had thought he'd never be able to rid himself of the stench of the sewage in his garage, but a hot shower and fresh clothes made him look civilized again. He'd had to shut off his own water to stop the flooding, and been forced to use his neighbor's bathroom. The only thing he had to do was call a plumber, but that could wait a few hours. His immediate priority was to go downtown to meet his daughter, who was coming in from the airport. He looked at himself in the mirror. From the outside, the illusion held, but inside everything seemed to be crumbling. Pain in his chest, stiff muscles, twinges in his lower back. Slowly but surely the cancer was working away. He needed something to cheer him up, so he rummaged in the drawer of a lacquered chest and took out a half-smoked joint. He went through his pockets for his lighter, a Zippo that his daughter had given him to mark the millennium, but it was nowhere to be found. He was annoyed and went into the kitchen to get a match to light his joint. He wasn't much of a dope smoker, and he wasn't a militant defender of the medical benefits of cannabis, but today he allowed himself this little self-medication. He took a few puffs and felt a little stronger. Then he closed his eyes and let his mind go blank until the beeping of the taxi's horn woke him from his meditation. He got to Laurie's Diner, his daughter's favorite restaurant, a few minutes early. He went upstairs and a waitress showed him to a little table by the window. looking out on Powell Street. Sitting on his stool, Elliot was diverted by the choreography of the cooks grilling steaks, frying eggs, and cooking slices of bacon on a huge grill. It was an unusual spot, with a 50s decor that served generous portions of traditional American food before all the low-cholesterol diets. It was the kind of food it was fashionable to criticize, but that everyone secretly loved. Burgers, home fries, ice cream, sodas, and milkshakes. The jukebox in the middle of the room played one Elvis song after another, and at one end an authentic Harley-Davidson was suspended from the ceiling by a tangled mass of wires above a row of pinball machines. When he came here, Elliot always felt like he was in Back to the Future. And every time the door opened, he almost expected to see Marty McFly and Doc Brown walking in, followed by the faithful Einstein. This very scenario was running through his mind when a customer walked in. But it wasn't Marty. It was a young woman with straight blonde hair who seemed to light up the room around her. A young woman of 20. A girl. His girl. Angie. He watched her coming, and for a minute he looked at her without her noticing him. There was no denying that she was attractive, with her long, tight cashmere sweater, a cotton skirt, which he thought was too short, black tights with a glossy sheen, and leather boots. But he wasn't the only one looking at her. At the next table, a little jerk was going into raptures in front of his friends about the blonde bombshell walking in their direction. Elliot gave him a dirty look. As a father, he cursed all testosterone carriers, without exception, who looked at his daughter as a sexual object. Angie finally saw him and happily waved hello. As this radiant creature walked toward him, he was filled with the conviction that having his daughter was unquestionably the best thing he had ever done.
End of CD 3.